Hello everyone. In this video, we will continue to look at stellar evolution and stellar evolution on HR diagrams. And in particular, we will continue to look at low mass stellar evolution. So a quick reminder that in low mass stellar evolution, stars that do not have sufficient mass to fuse carbon and oxygen will slowly eject their outer layers in what are called thermal pulses as they sort of fizzle out. These outer layers become what are known as planetary nebula. And planetary nebula are gorgeous. They're beautiful. They are some of the most beautiful images we have of space and space things. We initially thought that they were the birth. What we're seeing with these planetary nebula is where planets were born. And as it turns out, that's not the case. So planetary nebula have nothing to do with planets, but they've retained their name historically. And they glow. And why do they glow? They glow because the UV and high energy radiation from the hot white core that is still in the center of the planetary nebula is being absorbed by those outer gas layers that had been ejected, that were sort of initially those outer layers of a red giant. So that those outer layers of hydrogen and helium are absorbing that UV and high energy radiation and then re-emitting it with emission spectra in particular wavelength bands. And so they light up and you can see them. If you take a look at this image right here, you can see that the central star, that remaining core, is really, really small compared to that nearly spherical shell of ejected material. And sometimes you get a perfectly spherical shell, and then sometimes you get some interesting torus shapes, as in this particular nebula, that are explained right here, if you're interested. But they tend to be beautiful, and you tend to get some really brilliant colors. These are true color images that you're seeing here of these planetary nebula. But those outer layer nebula are not the only thing that's left. The hot, dense, and inert core, right? Remember that this core was the carbon and oxygen, and there wasn't enough carbon and oxygen to continue to fuse. That core becomes what is known as a white dwarf, or a white dwarf star. You do need to know this particular terminology. It is called a white dwarf star because if you take a look on the HR diagram, what happens is that sort of core remnant is going to be very hot. So it will be in sort of that white band, and somewhere between sort of an A and F type usually. And it will be very, very small, relatively speaking. White dwarf stars are roughly the size of the Earth. Not much bigger than that, although they are very hot, which means although their luminosity is low, it is not impossible to see them. You can actually see them. So if we zoom in here, Sirius A is a main sequence type star. That's a main sequence star. The white dwarf that we're talking about is actually right here. So Sirius B is a white dwarf and can be made out. It's much smaller and therefore has a much smaller luminosity. But what's going on with these guys is that there's no fusion anymore. So although we call them white dwarf stars, they're not technically stars at that point. They're not fusing hydrogen or anything else for that matter at the core. And what keeps them up is just purely the electron degeneracy pressure that we mentioned before. This electron degeneracy pressure is provided by the Pauli exclusion principle. As a reminder, electrons cannot occupy the same physical state. That's what makes them fermions. And this is a calculable outer pressure, okay? And this is true as long as the core is less than about 1.4 solar masses. That limit is known as the Chandrasekhar limit. If the core is bigger than that, the core has higher mass than 1.4 solar masses, and it will actually break through this electron degeneracy pressure in a process we'll talk about in a later video. And white dwarf stars are pretty amazing. They are very, very dense. They're at what's called sort of this maximum density before the electrons are sort of forced into the nucleus. And a single spoonful of a white dwarf will weigh about as much as an elephant, has about the same mass as an elephant. So they are very, very dense. And because this electron degeneracy pressure is constant, then you actually get a weird trend in white dwarfs where the higher the mass of the white dwarf, right, the closer you are to the Chandrasekhar limit, the smaller the white dwarf. The outer pressure is the same, okay, that outward electron degeneracy pressure is the same, and so with increased gravitational pressure inwards, you actually get a smaller radius for that white dwarf. That is the inverse of the relationship that we saw on the main sequence. One last thought here, one last idea, is that this, you are now in a position to explain the full evolution of the sun or a solar type star from top to bottom. And you should be able to do this in sort of a longer, more extended answer and diagram it out on the HR diagram. So I'm just going to point out that the evolution of the sun, in this case, is sort of what we're calling a low mass star, is something you should be able to explain in full and detail on an HR diagram.